The graphics program that I prefer to use is Adobe Photoshop. There are many graphics editing programs on the market. Photoshop happens to be one of the premier tools for editing graphics, and is my preferred choice. I'll double-click on the Photoshop icon on my desktop to launch Adobe Photoshop, and I'll quickly clean up my floating palettes by resetting the Essentials view so my Photoshop tool is a little easier on our eye. And now in Photoshop, under the File menu, I'm going to open a file inside the Chapter 4 folder in the miscellaneous directory, and that file is Tsxwdv. If you get the embedded color profile mismatch, click OK. And if you get a warning message when you open this file asking you to update layers, you can simply hit the Update button. As we learned a moment ago, generally speaking, GIF is the preferred format for saving images that have lots of text. How do we save an image as a GIF in Photoshop? When we have images in Photoshop that we intend to export for use on the web, we'll make use of the Save for Web and Devices function, which is under the File menu. So File, Save for Web and Devices. And that brings up a dialog that allows us to, when I look in the 2-up view, see a preview of the original image and what a rendering of that image would look like with a format other than the original image. In the original image we had the Photoshop format .psd as our image format. Now I want to see what this image would look like as a GIF. So I'm going to change the file format to GIF with my control palettes on the right hand side of my screen. And if I zoom in on my preview pane, and I'll grab my zoom tool from the tool palette, my cursor icon changes to a magnification glass with a plus inside it. And if I zoom in and switch tools to the hand tool so I can click and move my image around, I can see that Photoshop is anti-aliasing my image for me. Anti-aliasing are these little in-between steps between the black text and the white background that, when zoomed out, create the nice smooth curve we see around characters of text in the GIF format, or any format for that matter. And this looks acceptable, and I could go ahead and create a GIF of this image to be used inside a web page. But what happens when I pick JPEG as my format? If I switch to JPEG, and a standard quality setting might be about 30%. Let me bring that down because we're dealing with a very simple image. I can see a little bit of noise starting to come in above my characters. It'll be more pronounced if I bring the quality down a little bit more. You're starting to see a little bit more of it over the U. I'm going to zoom in on that character, U, to highlight the point. I'll exaggerate the point by bringing the quality down a little bit more. These pixels which you're seeing are nowhere near the perimeter of the letters. This is an example of lossiness being incorporated into my image. These artifacts are not part of the original image and are something that we don't want. Now this is a very simple image, and in JPEG format, if I was to punch up my quality to 100%, they would go away. But I also increase the file size of my image. If I bring that quality setting back down, the file size, which we can see in the lower left-hand side, changes from 12K down to 4K. Now, this is not really a tremendous concern to us. This is just an example. But file size is a consideration you want to take into account as you're building out your images, because if someone has a slow internet connection, your web page may take a longer period of time to load if you have very large images embedded within your web pages. In this example, that's not much of a concern because we're dealing with a very simple subject matter. But I just wanted to show you an example of where lossiness comes in and how it might start to degrade the quality of your images, especially ones that have text in them. But let's take a look at the other scenario we discussed. Let's take a look at JPEG as the file format that we want to use for an image. I'm going to cancel out of this screen by clicking the Cancel button, and I'll close down my image file. Under the File menu, I'll click Open, and in Chapter 4, under the Images directory, I'll select this image of Saturn and click Open. This image of Saturn comes to us courtesy of NASA. NASA allows anyone to link to or use their images, but NASA does not explicitly endorse this series. You can read more about the rights to use their images on their site at www.nasa.gov. Now, if I zoom in on this image in Photoshop using the magnification tool, and I'll zoom in a little bit more, notice these shades of greenish yellow and to a lesser degree purple in the rings of Saturn. Also notice beyond the perimeter of those rings there's some extra pixel information around the rings, and I can see more of it here in the shadow in this kind of yellowish brownish mix. This is lossiness inside my image. Now when I zoom out, holding down the Command key and pressing minus on my keyboard to zoom out, Control minus on Windows, to view the image at 100%, your mind doesn't perceive that lossiness. You don't recognize it. It doesn't stand out because it blends in with the rest of the information. To be sure, when this image was captured by NASA, the image was massive, huge, hundreds of megabytes in size. That original source image was sampled down to something that a desktop computer could handle easily. That was accomplished using the JPEG format, with the lossiness of the JPEG formatting streaming out some of that extra information, sizing down the file size to something manageable. Now, I also mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, we want to pay attention to the color space that's assigned to our image. Under the Image menu in Photoshop, there's the Mode group, and under the Mode group you can see that there are several color spaces available to us. The two that we're concerned with right now at the beginning of your web design career are RGB and CMYK. This image is already in the RGB color space, and we're going to leave that alone. In Photoshop, you can also see that the RGB color space is applied to this image. If I switch over to the Color panel, I can change the display of color space to show CMYK sliders, so I can see the CMYK values of this image. This would be useful if I was going to take this image and have it printed on a large scale with a 4-color offset printer. We're not interested in doing that for this example. We're targeting digital display of our imagery instead of printed display of our imagery. The last consideration that I mentioned at the onset of considering how you're going to format your images for use in web pages was to mention image dimension. In Photoshop, you can control the size of your images using the Image menu. Under the Image menu, if you select Image Size, you can see the width and height currently assigned to your image and the document size of your image when printed. The pixel dimensions for our use, displayed in width and height, represent how your image will be viewed on screen, as opposed to the size of the image when actually printed. For web images, we want to target a resolution of 72 pixels per inch. This is the standard resolution of computer screens and is the resolution you want to use for images that you're going to incorporate into your web page. I mention this because you may purchase stock images from a web-based reseller of stock imagery that you wish to use inside your website, but oftentimes those images that you might download might be in 300, 600, 1200, 2400 dots per inch if you bought a high-quality image. If you wanted to get that image, which may already be in JPEG format, into your web page without having to make the visitor download a gigantic file, which you want to avoid, you would come into Photoshop or whatever graphics tool you have available and change the image resolution. And in this case, with the image size dialog, I can change the resolution of this image down to 72 pixels per inch, which this image is already at, so I'll cancel out of this dialog.